uh, recording today. So there we go. So welcome to the second in our series of TABE webinar trainings. We know that TABE testing is a huge part of achieving performance in adult education for our GED students. And as a result, there's always a lot of rules and regulations and policies and procedures that govern how we use the TABE. So we're going to talk about some of those assessment policies and procedures and some of the reasons behind some of the rules that we have. And again, as always, if you have questions or concerns or comments or some discussion, by all means, unmute yourself, let us hear it. Because that's how we all learn best. And I'm going to start out by answering a couple of questions that people had since last week's training. So one of the ones was, where can we find the TABE test directions books? And I'm going to show you, if you log in to your DRC account, it's actually pretty easy to find those books. So are y'all seeing my DRC screen? Yes, no. Yes, Jen's giving me a nod. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. My little green square went away, so I was a little concerned at first, but hopefully we're good. Okay, so if you log into your DRC account, up here under My Applications, actually, I'm going to bump this up a little higher so it's easier for y'all to see if you're on a smaller screen. Under My Applications, if you go to the General Information tab, general information has a lot of general information. And one of the things that it has, if you click on documents there and tell it to show, well, actually, I'm not going to show them all. I'm just going to ask it to show the manuals and training materials and ask it to show documents. You can see you've got the TABE test direction and test administration manuals. You want the TABE 11 and 12. I don't think there's anybody in the state that's doing TABE Class E. And you can see you can get it either as a PDF to download, or you can just view the PDF and open it right there. So if we open it, it is what it says it is. It's the TABE Test Administration Manual. You can either save it or you can print it. I do think, though, if you bought printed materials at the beginning of TABE 11 and 12, you probably have those printed test directions books somewhere. So before you spend the money on printing one, take a look around and see if you can find those. But if you do need to refer back to it, you can always go and grab it from the DRC website. So that's where that is. And then people also had questions about where to find the downloadable documents, or I'm sorry, not the downloadable documents, what you need to do in order to clean up your test sessions in TABE. So if you're somebody who works with TABE online, those test sessions can get a little bit out of control. And we talked about that last week in terms of how you name them. But I also want to show you what you can do in order to see if there are some of those sessions that you can just delete out of your account. I'm going to say you need to be very sure that you're doing this in a way that's not going to get rid of your previous test results, right? Because all of those test results live in those test sessions. So if we click on Manage Test Sessions, and again, I'm going to kind of narrow down the sessions that we see and hit Show Sessions, just because it takes a little less time to load that way. On all of your test sessions then, again, I'm going to try and bump this up a little. You can see on all of your test sessions, you'll have a status column that shows whether or not those test sessions have been started. If the test session says status started, it means that somebody in that test session, or if it says in progress, somebody in that test session has started taking tests in there, right? So if you've got that in progress, There are people who have logged in and are actively taking TABE tests in that session or have taken TABE tests in that session. Anything that says not started means that nobody has logged into a test for that test session yet. So that could mean that that's a test session that could be deleted out. Now, again, you want to be cautious about this. You want to be careful. You want to do all your due diligence before you start knocking test sessions out of your account. And also, if you share those test sessions with other people, you're going to mess them up too. So I'm urging a lot of caution before you do this. I do this at the end of the fiscal year just to get rid of any that don't have any students in them, because it makes the list a little cleaner. But I only do it basically that one time a year. And again, I'm very, very careful about it. One of the things I do to make sure that it actually is a test session that doesn't have any test results in it is this little button to the right of the test session name with the green arrow that says export details. If you click on that button, you get a report. Now, I'm not going to click on it there because I pulled one out earlier and took the identifying student information out of it so that wasn't in the report that I was going to show you. But this is the actual report that it printed. And the student information is just initials rather than their names, right? So you can see that this is a lot, right? It's a lot. What I do is you don't have to look at all of this, right? When you're trying to figure out if you need to hang on to this test session. What you need to look at is this column that says status. So the status column, again, will tell you if these students have started any part of this test. Now I'm going to highlight just a chunk of this so you can see. Pick a color that's nicer than yellow. We'll make it that nice peachy color. This is one student, okay? This is one student in this test session. This student hasn't started any of the tests. You can see the assessment name, locator language, the sample items, the language test, the 2 locator math tests, again, the sample items, the math tests, the locator reading, the sample items, the reading tests. All of those say not started. So student AB has not started any of this test that they were assigned to. However, if you look just below them, student AM has completed some tests. They completed the math part 1 and 2. They completed the locators part 1 and 2. They didn't do any of the rest of it yet. The rest of those tests and the complete battery are not started for that student. But if you've got any students in there that say completed and you delete that test session, you're deleting any of those test results that belong to that person. So you want to be very careful about this. If you're going to start trying to clean up your test sessions, I would really recommend looking at this report just to make sure if there's anything that says completed in there, you know you don't want to delete that whole test session. Questions about that? So after one of you had emailed this question in to John Anderson and me. And John actually, after getting this question, John reached out to Mike Johnson, who's our DRC representative, to confirm exactly how this works, right? How our test administrations work. So I have Mike's answer to John, and I'm quoting here, okay? This is Mike's answer verbatim. This is a quote. The end date of a session simply stops any unused test tickets from being used to start a specific test. Of course, a program can edit the end date if needed to extend the test session date. When you create the test session, this is me talking again, this is not Mike. When you create the test session, you give it a beginning date and end date. If that end date is in the past, it won't let you add new people to that test session. You can change that end date and make it possible to add people again, but the end date doesn't do anything other than stop you from adding new people to a session. Okay. Here's Mike again. DRC is in the process of an archiving process, not deletion, of older TABE data within the Insight system. The goal at the end of the archiving is that programs will see an active list of the last 18 months of data. We hope this process is finished later this winter. So they know it's an issue, that when you look at your test sessions, you've got like miles and miles of things listed there. So they're in the process of going through and archiving the older things, which means those test results will still be available. If you want to go back and look at a student's test results from, I don't know, 2018, you can, but those test sessions will be archived, so they won't be on your main screens when you log in. Mike also said, only when a test is started by a student does it count toward the usage number. And this is interesting because I didn't know this next part. The locator tests don't count against our usage number. Simply registering a student for a test does not count toward the usage total. Okay. So it's not until the student has completed the locator and actually starts taking a test that's not a locator test within DRC, within the TABE, that they count against our test usage numbers. That's when they say, okay, you're using a test administration and we're going to subtract one off of South Dakota's available total. So interesting information there from Mike at DRC. I was really grateful that John had reached out to him and asked about that. Because like I said, there were a couple things in there that I didn't know. So we can always learn something new whenever we start asking these questions. Anybody have any questions about any of that? Thanks to those of you who put those questions out there. I appreciate it. And again, if you have questions, either while we're in training today, or if they come to you after and you want to ask, always reach out with an email, and we'll see if we can find the best answers that we can. So.
Jackie, this is Carla.
Yeah.
Could you possibly show us where, when after the student has done the locator test, can you show us how to go in to see what level of tests they're going to be taking?
Yeah, there's a couple ways to do that. You can go through, test management. Oh, sorry, not test management. You can go through reports, report delivery. And under the on-demand reports, you can actually select the locator profile. And that locator profile for a student is just the locator levels. And that'll give you what level of each test they would take.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yep. There's another way to do it. There's like a backdoor way to do it. And I'm not sure I remember well enough to show you just on the fly, but I'll look at that again. And if I can figure it out again, I know I've done it a different way. If I can figure it out again, I will, I'll show you next week. Any others? All right, if not, then let's take a look at what we're going to cover today. We're going to review just some basics of the National Reporting System, or the NRS, as it pertains to TABE testing. We're going to specifically talk about periods of participation in assessment, because that's one of the things that gets kind of confusing for people. And then we're going to wrap up by just discussing the major points of South Dakota's assessment policy that are related to TABE testing. So this is going to be a review for some of you, but I always think it's a good review when we talk about NRS and performance, because there's a lot of rules and regulations associated with this, and it never hurts to put them kind of at the top of our minds again. So all federal funding is tied to performance expectations, right? And WIOA is no different. The National Reporting System, or NRS, is the accountability system for federally funded adult education programs. It's authorized by Section 212 of the WIOA legislation that was passed in 2014. And we know as adult ed programs, we're required to show measurable skills gains for our learners. There are really two main ways for adult ed students to achieve a measurable skill gain. They can either complete an educational functioning level, or they can complete their high school equivalency during the program year. Completing their high school equivalency is pretty straightforward. Any participant who starts with us and successfully completes the GED between July 1st and June 30th gets a measurable skills gain because they've completed that high school equivalency. The criteria for completing an educational functioning level, though, is a little more complex. There are 3 ways to complete an educational functioning level, but one of them, completion of Carnegie units, doesn't apply to South Dakota Title II programs because none of us have the ability to grant secondary credits through the completion of Carnegie units. So that leaves us with 2 ways to measure an EFL gain, or an educational functioning level gain. Pre and post test scores is one, and program exit followed by enrollment in post-secondary education or training within the program year is the other one. So let's talk about these. One way we can get a measurable skills gain is if people exit our program and then enter post-secondary education in the same program year. We do have students who come to us with high school diplomas who need to build their skills before they can enter post-secondary school, who will achieve an MSG this way, a measurable skills gain. We also have, and this is where Cornerstones has had a couple of students who have actually made a measurable skills gain this way. We also have learners who have a high school degree or high school diploma from another country who come into our English second language program, study with us to improve their English language skills with the idea that they want to go on to post-secondary school. And then when their English language skills get to a point where they feel confident that they'll be able to manage that workload in post-secondary, they leave our program and they enroll in a post-secondary school. Cornerstones has had a couple of people achieve a measurable skills gain that way over the years. But I think the vast majority of our students demonstrate measurable skills gains through pre and post testing. And when we talk about students demonstrating improvement through pre and post testing, we're talking about gaining an EFL, gaining an educational functioning level. And as you all know, each of those levels has its own negotiated performance level that represents the percentage of students who start the fiscal year at that assessed level and are able to gain at least 1 level by the end of the fiscal year. What's hard about that is that each educational functioning level represents 2 or sometimes 3 grade level equivalents. So our participants have to make big gains in order to hit those EFLs every year. Many of our participants will make large scale score gains on the TABE, but still don't score high enough to gain an EFL. That's not unusual for our participants, and it's also not unusual to need to take more than 1 post test before gaining an EFL. And I think another important thing to remember about measurable skill gains is that only 1 gain is counted for each participant per period of participation. And that's the last gain that is achieved is the one that counts on reports. So that means if you've got a participant who makes an educational functioning level gain on a post test, they get that EFL gain when they take their post TABE, you don't necessarily have to give them another post test during that fiscal year because you're not going to get extra credit for them gaining 2 educational functioning levels, right? Also, if a participant completes their GED during the fiscal year, that counts as a measurable skill gain. So you don't have to do a TABE post test in that case. Questions
Say
about
that
any
again.
if a participant completes their GED during the fiscal year, that counts as a measurable skill gain. So you don't have to have a TABE post test for that person. You know, Judy, back when you and I first started doing this, it didn't matter. If they got their GED, you still had to have a TABE post test to show a measurable skill gain. You still had to have that post test to show a gain on our reports. It's not like that anymore, which is so much better because it was just ridiculous for somebody to get their GED and then have to ask them to come back in and take another TABE test. It was silly.
Wow, that's cool.
Yep. Yeah, that was a good change to the regulations. So yeah, we don't have to have an additional TABE if they get their GED completed during the fiscal year. So I mentioned periods of participation a couple of times. That term refers to a key feature of WIOA that we need to keep in mind as we work with our participants. Periods of participation, or sometimes they're shortened to POPs, can impact TABE testing. A period of participation starts when a person enrolls in your program. Their program entry date is generally the date on which they complete that intake paperwork with you. And once a person enters your program and completes 12 or more contact hours, a period of participation starts, and that's when they're officially a participant in your program. That's when they're going to show on your tables. That's when they're going to count as a participant that you're serving that year. The period of participation continues until a student exits the program. So the next question then is, how do we determine that program exit? According to NRS guidelines, program exit occurs when that person has gone at least 90 days without receiving services and there are no additional services scheduled. So the way we think about this is 90 days without any contact hours with that student, right? So if you have somebody who comes in, starts with you, does 30 hours of instruction, and then, as often happens, they'll fall off the face of the earth for us for a while, right? If it's 91 days, that person is exited. You can stop that clock from ticking by giving someone a scheduled future service date in LACES. This is a thing that you physically do in the LACES program. If you know there will be a gap in their attendance that could be 90 days or more, but they are planning to come back. Now, this does happen. There are different things that can happen in a person's life that might take them away from us for a period of time. It could be somebody taking an extended trip to a foreign country, right? Maybe somebody is working extended hours that prevent them from coming to class for a period of time. Mandatory overtime knocks students out of our classes a lot of times, right? In the correctional setting, it might be somebody who's placed in the secure housing unit for a while and does not have the ability to come to class. So you can schedule a time when you believe they're going to come back into your program. A lot of students know this, right? If they're taking a trip, it's like, I'm going to be gone from this time to this time. I'm planning to come back to class on this day. Sometimes it's a little more guesswork involved with that. You know, you might know that they plan to be back on a certain day, but you can put that scheduled future service date in there. And then even if 90 days goes by, until you hit that scheduled future service date with no hours, that student stays enrolled with you. They're not exited from the program.
Becky, this is Carla again. I have a question on that. What would you do? I actually have this. I have a student that just was sent by the courts to treatment. We have no idea when he's going to be back. It depends on how he does, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you were doing this, would you wait till it gets closer to knowing that 90 days is going to be there and do that? Or would you just go ahead and do it now?
I always try and do them as soon as I can because I don't want to run the risk of forgetting. And maybe you're better than me at that. But yeah, I always go in and put them in. And, you know, the other thing you can do is you can change that scheduled future service date. So you can put one in now. And then if you get word that, you know, he's ready to come back, but it's going to be maybe 2 weeks after that scheduled future service date, you can go in and extend that. It's okay to do that. And I always, again, you always just make those comments so that it's clear what you're doing and why you're doing it. So when I go in and put that date in, then I also go into the comment section for that student and say, you know, I gave the student a scheduled future service date for this reason. You know, they're out for this reason. They plan to come back.
What if you put that in there and then, so if I went in and did it now, but he's back in 30 days, do you have to go in and take that out?
Nope. As soon as you put hours in for them again, it just takes that out of consideration, right? So once he's got hours, then it recognizes, oh, he's active again. So you're going to be okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I know it's tricky, but it does come up more often than we think, really. And yeah, treatment is another good example. And yep, Steph said you can also make them exempt from post-test if it is further out, if it's going to cross a fiscal year, those kinds of things. So yeah, that it does get tricky. And there, as soon as you think you've accounted for all the situations that could possibly come up, you haven't. So I'm still surprised after this many years at how many different things can happen in the lives of our students. Now, the caveat to that 90 days with no services, and if you have if you don't have a scheduled future service date, is that the exit date isn't official until that 90 days has elapsed. So, for example, our staff is really good at telling me when they find out that a student is moving or has moved. So even if I know the student has moved to a different state and they're not going to come back to class, I can go in and mark them as left in laces. But until that 90 days with no contact hours passes, they're not officially exited, right? I can say, I know they're not coming back, I'm going to mark them as left, but laces doesn't recognize that they're gone until that 90 days has passed. Once that happens, once they hit day 91, the period of participation is ended, and then they go into that follow-up period where John Anderson's going to get their information on employment and wages and that kind of thing for those follow-up performance measures.
What if you did that with somebody and you exited them, they're still, the system still has them in because of not being gone for 90 days, but they come back in 30 days. And we know that happens all the time. Can you, that won't put them into a second period of participation? It won't, because you're going to have hours in and it will stop that 90-day process. Okay.
Yep, exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah, whatever we do doesn't really matter until that 90 days is done, which, I mean, it's a nice safety net for us because the system is going to say, well, yeah, that person came back now. It's like they were never gone to the system. So yeah, and what this means in terms of TABE testing is you want to try to get a measurable skill gain, which often equals a post-test that leads to an EFL gain, either before or after that period of participation ends. You can get that post-test even just right after that period of participation ends. So I know these periods of participation, this is a hard thing to get our minds around sometimes. So, we do have people who leave our program for more than 90 days, but then come back, right? Everybody's had some of those. We don't know where they go or what they do. They disappear for a while and then they're back. They always think it's less time than it has been, but often it's at least a few months. According to the NRS, every entry is counted as a new period of participation, even if it comes during the same fiscal year. So if you have a person who enters your program and stays for at least 12 hours, then leaves for 90 or more days and comes back and re-enrolls, that person has 2 periods of participation in the same program year. So what does that mean? Technically, the system counts them as 2 people on our statistics. Yep. So I like visuals for this, right? This is helpful. So let's take a look at how this can play out. Julie comes into our program at the beginning of July. She's excited to get her GED. You complete paperwork, an initial TABE test with her. She goes through orientation. She starts attending class faithfully. So she gets way more than 12 hours of instruction. So that's the beginning of her first period of participation. So POP 1 begins as soon as she hits that 12-hour mark with an assessment. She's a participant. At the beginning of October, Julie's work tells her that they're going to be having mandatory overtime. So she lets you know, I'm not going to be able to come to class anymore. I'm just not going to have time in my day. It's not going to work in my schedule. You tell her, thank you so much for letting me know. You make sure to give her a post-TABE because she's got enough hours. She stops coming to class. You can mark her as left in laces, but she doesn't show as being technically exited until that 90 days has passed. And that's when that period of participation, that first one, ends. So now Julie's going to be counted in your follow-up performance for employment and median earnings on your NRS reports. Okay. In March, Julie calls you and she says, hey, mandatory overtime is done. My work hours have settled down. I want to come back in and start studying again. You say, great, welcome back. So happy that you're going to come back and work with us again. Because it's been more than 90 days since Julie last attended, she's going to count as a new student in your program. You should update information on her intake, and you want to pay special attention to barriers to employment if anything has changed there, employment status, the other required information for reporting, make sure her contact information is up to date, and then enroll her and she can start attending. And once she's attended 12 hours, her second period of participation begins. Okay. Julie attends class until the end of the program year in June. She's studying hard. She's able to complete all 4 final GED tests successfully before the end of June. So you don't have to give her a TABE post-test to determine EFL gain. The GED completion counts as a measurable skill gain. And that's the end of her second period of participation. Now, you might have noticed that I didn't say you had to give Julie a new TABE test when she came back to your program in March. And that's because technically we don't have to reassess her at that time. Assessments can carry over to new periods of participation if the student returns before the test has expired. And our state assessment policy says that we can use TABE scores for 180 days. They stay valid for 180 days, or it's about 6 months, right? We're going to talk more about that in a minute, but what it means in Julie's case is that because we gave her a post-test at the end of her first period of participation in October, that score is still going to be valid at the beginning of her second period of participation in March. You don't have to give her a new TABE test. You can use the post-test from POP 1 as the pre-test for POP 2. Questions about that? There's one more thing that we have to remember about multiple periods of participation. Since Julie has 2 periods of participation in this fiscal year, she technically counts as 2 people on our NRS reports. So why is that important? We know she got a measurable skill gain for POP 2 because she completed her GED. But if she didn't gain an EFL on her post-TABE in October, she didn't have a measurable skill gain for POP 1. That means that Julie's net performance for the year on our reports is 50%, right? She had 1 period of participation where she didn't make a gain, and she had 1 where she did. So she counts as 2 people in the denominator, but she only had 1 gain. That gives us 50%. Now, if she had made a gain on her TABE in October, it would have been 100%. And then she's 2 people who count for us fully, right? Yay. But if she hadn't finished her GED at the end of June, by the end of June, and she hadn't made a gain on a TABE, it would have been like 2 people not making any gains. Now, do we need to be stressed out about this? Not too much. We need to be careful about it, right? If we can extend somebody's period of participation with that scheduled future service date, we should. But the number of people statewide that are coming back in for second periods of participation are pretty small. John's not with us today, but he would have numbers on this, and I was going to look it up before I came on and I didn't have a chance to, but they're not big numbers. It's not enough to sway us a ton, right? So be cautious, be careful about it, be aware of it, but don't stress over this. It's not going to hurt us to the point where it's going to make a big difference in our performance on our NRS tables for each year, okay? So I just want to.
Vicki, thanks for explaining all that, because I mean, I've been here for a long time. That's always been really confusing to me, and now it makes sense. Thank you.
It's so confusing. You're welcome. I know it's good for me to have to do these kinds of things, to go back and review it and really think through all of it, because it's just, there are so many little pieces of it and you lose track sometimes. You know, we have so many other things to remember that are so much more important day to day, that sometimes just remembering all the little ins and outs of those periods of participation can be hard. So yeah, just to recap it. Participants with a 90-day gap in services can have more than 1 period of participation in a program year. When a participant re-enrolls after that 90-day gap with no hours, they're treated like a new person. You have to update their intake, but you might not need to administer a new TABE test as long as their last TABE is less than 180 days old, right?
Mm.
Any other questions, comments on all of that?
I have one, but it's all corrections. When
Okay,
we
no, that's
give them
fine.
their intakes,
Uh-huh.
nothing changes because
Right.
yeah, they've been here for 4 years.
Right.
How important is it to get a new intake form when virtually nothing on that form has changed?
You know, I don't think it's that important as long as you acknowledge that you went in and checked, right? You just made sure that everything stayed the same. There wasn't anything different. I do know that it's important to make the updates in LACES, even if nothing has changed, right? So when you go in, you have certain screens that you want to make sure you update. And that includes, you want to make sure you update those barriers. So you enter a new barriers record for that new intake date if there's that gap. You enter a new work history, which isn't going to change at all for you guys. You know, barriers might change. I mean, maybe something happened and they, you know, lost vision in an eye or something, so now they're visually impaired, so they have a disability or something like that. Your work history isn't going to change. Those are really the main ones. And then of course you want to look at their assessment and enrollment. Those are the screens that I always look at when we've got somebody who re-enrolls with us. But yeah, I think, you know, if you're just notating on there the re-enrollment date and no changes and initialing it, I don't think you need to do a whole new form. I would double check with John on that, just because, you know, he's going to do your file audit at some point, but I don't think that he's going to make you do anything that's not necessary. I'm a paperwork minimalist. I mean, there are things we have to have, but there are things that you know, I think that you can just do by saying no updates and initialing it. And if their employment status hasn't changed, do I need to make a new entry? I usually do, Amy. I just because it's like it's a new entry. So just to make sure that that it's obvious that I checked, I usually go in and I just put a new entry in there for employment, even if it hasn't changed. It's a good question. The other thing I was going to mention is I'm not going to log into LACES and like go through how to do the scheduled future service date and that kind of thing. But if that's something that you feel like you need to see, definitely just be sure to email John and he'll put it on the LACES list for next training for the next month, that we can go in and take a look at that. And everybody can have a refresher about where that field is and what we do to enter it. Yeah. Any other questions?
Hi, Becky. This is Amy from LSS.
Yeah.
Okay, so quick question, just maybe for clarification.
Yep.
What you said that scores are good for 6 months, right? Okay, so if a student leaves the program, I feel like this is mental gymnastics. Okay, a student leaves the program, they come back, let's say after 2 months or whatever. But their test, so they're not in a new POP. But let's say their test is 7 months ago. I don't need to.
So, okay, yeah. So as long as they're still active, right? They didn't officially exit. They might have been absent, but they didn't officially exit.
Right, yeah.
Okay. I wouldn't give them a new TABE. They still have a TABE of record that's valid, right?
Yeah.
So until they hit that hours mark for post-testing, I
Mhm.
wouldn't give them a new TABE. And it is mental gymnastics, you're right. And this is one of the reasons that I always tell our teachers that it's my job to keep track of that, because I've got it in LACES. So there are so many times that I'll get either emails or somebody stopping in my door and just like, can you double check this for me? You know, like this person's coming back. Can you double check for me? Do I need to retape them or no? And then, you know, then we have two minds working on it and double checking our math and making sure that we know exactly what's going on. So that we don't, because you don't want to over test. And I think that's one of the things that we really want to underscore with TABE testing is the tests are long, they're hard on our students. We don't want to over test them with this test. So yeah, that would be an instance where I would say, nope, we're still good. That test is still in there as their valid pretest for the fiscal year. And even though, you know, it would have gone off, if they'd been gone longer, we're still good. That's a good question.
Okay, so then my follow-up question to that, thank you, Becky, is that what if the student was gone 95 days and their TABE is 7 months old? Then I need to retape.
Then you're going to need to retape them. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But
and this is true of Best Plus as well. I mean, it's enrolled applied, so okay.
Yeah. But, and again, with the TABE, and I think that this, you know, it might be a non-starter with LSS students, but only in one subject area. I would not give them the complete battery all over again when they're a returner. I mean, we know how they did that first time, right? And we know that it probably hasn't markedly changed. So when they are a returner, I tell people only give them that one subject area. There's no need to do that whole complete battery again. Unless it's been a really long period of time. You know, we have people who come back after maybe 2 years, then I would maybe give them another complete battery. But if they're just coming in, you know, a month or two after that 6-month period is expired, I'm not going to make them take all 3 tests again.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you for looking that up. If anyone's interested, 2022-23, 1575 participants and 1632 pops. 2021, 22, 1640 participants and 1676 pops. So, you know, we're not overly concerned about that. But again, if there's a way to knock some of them down, by all means, utilize that scheduled future service date. Thank you, Southeast Tech, for pulling that out for me. Love that. So yeah, we're right around. We've never hit 100. We've never hit 100 duplicates in there, so, which is not bad. There are some states that have an issue with that. We're not one of them. So Amy's questions, actually, it was like you set me up there. They lead us right into our next topic, which is if you have any questions about TABE testing or you need to review any of this information, you can always refer back to the South Dakota State Assessment Policy. That policy is updated every year to reflect any changes to the assessment policy and any changes to federal or state regulations. The state assessment policy is always available in the Title II document library in the SharePoint. If you don't have access to SharePoint, you can always ask John Anderson to send you a copy of the assessment policy, or you can ask your director or coordinator. They have access to that SharePoint. The assessment policy not only covers testing procedures like the use of the locator test, but it also outlines appropriate timeframes for when a student should be given TABE tests, post tests, all those kinds of things. Test developers provide guidelines regarding the amount of time that should be spent in study between the pre and post testing sessions, and the state policy reflects those guidelines. So I actually have a copy of the state policy here. It's not at all flashy. The cover is just this. And usually, if there have been changes from one year to the next, John does a really good job of listing them on this cover page for us so that we can see what areas we might need to review. There really weren't any changes this last year. So, you know, he's required to update that annually and to submit it to the federal partners for their approval. And then he makes sure that we get a copy of it every year as well. Jeanette, I don't have the direct link to that SharePoint. John can send you a direct link to that SharePoint so that you can pull it out. I can also, if you guys want, I mean, I can email you a copy of it. It's just a PDF. But I just wanted to kind of run through the table of contents with you. I'm not going to certainly read it to you because y'all can read. But there's the introduction and overview for South Dakota, and it talks about like the importance of assessment, the NRS requirements, accountability issues, reliability and validity of the assessments that NRS has approved, the purpose and uses of the assessments, and then it goes straight into TABE guidelines, and you can see all the things that we've kind of outlined here in an overview kind of fashion, right? Minimum instruction, documentation, timeframes for pre-testing and post-testing, testing students who stopped out, that post-testing rate, the guidelines for assessment administration, all those requirements and policies and procedures, and then showing progress, entering scores and laces, all those kinds of things. I'm going to flip down here though and show you one of the things that is always included in the assessment policy each year are the negotiated performance targets for the program year. So this is where those percents that we're supposed to hit for each instructional level are for your review every year. So if you're wondering like, what do I have to hit for a percentage in high intermediate ABE this year? Oh yeah, 52%, went up 1% from last year. So the state assessment policy always has a listing of those current negotiated performance measures. So if you're looking for those to compare to your NRS tables, this is where they are. I always think it's a good idea to at least skim through the assessment policy kind of once a year, just to give yourself a reminder of all the ins and outs and things that are important in there. You certainly don't have to do a thorough read of every part of it every single year, because again, if nothing has changed, hopefully you're familiar with those things. But if you ever do have questions, it's a good resource to check. And again, you can email John anytime if you've got those questions, and he will definitely give you an answer. But if you're just looking for something that's maybe a quick answer, you do have access to that state assessment policy. Questions about that? All right. Then I just want to run through some of the key features in the TABE portion of the assessment policy. The test developers give us those guidelines regarding the amount of time that should be spent in study between pre and post testing, and the state policy is really based on the test developer guidelines. So the initial TABE assessment should be completed within the first 12 contact hours with the participant. Okay, that's best practice. Now, to be clear, the assessment will still count if it's completed after the first 12 contact hours. Okay, it's not like if I don't get them within 12 hours, I just am never going to get them. If they get 12.5 hours before you can get a TABE test on them, don't panic. It'll still count. They'll still be a participant, but you can't use hours completed before the pre-test in the minimum hours count for post-testing. Okay. So if someone attends class for 20 hours prior to the time where you get their initial TABE test on them, they're going to have to attend for another 40 additional hours after the TABE in order to be eligible for post-testing. That's where it works against you. There's also a fear that you've taught them so much before they get their pre-test that it'll be harder to get a gain on their post-test, right? So get that pre-test as soon as possible in that student's enrollment with you. It's just better all around for everybody, right? Again, the assessment results are valid for 180 days, and that means you can use TABE test results as assessments of record for about 6 months. Those 180 days can also cross fiscal years. So if somebody took a TABE in March, it's a valid assessment of record for that person until September, even though you're entering a new fiscal year. You can push that assessment forward in laces to count as the assessment for the new fiscal year, as long as it's within that 180-day window. So again, you don't have to reassess just because it's a new program year. That TABE is still good. Students who are at NRS levels 1 through 4, which are the grade equivalents 0 to 8.9 on the TABE, must have a minimum of 40 hours of instruction before testing with the alternate test form. So again, we usually start with 11, go to 12, go back to 11, then to 12. And students who are at NRS levels 5 and 6, which is grade equivalents 9.0 and up on the TABE, must have a minimum of 30 hours of instruction before testing with the alternate test form. Now, I stressed minimum there because it means minimum, okay? That guideline is there to keep us from testing before students would have a reasonable expectation of making a gain, okay? The test developers tell us they really need a number of hours of instruction before it's reasonable to expect that they might make an EFL gain. So just because it says that they have to have a minimum of 40 hours of instruction before taking a post-test doesn't mean that every 40 hours they need to take a test, right? Especially in our corrections program, that just gets silly. Because how long does it take for a student to get 40 hours of instruction in corrections? Week and a half, 2 weeks? Something like that. It's testing way too much. That 40-hour minimum means that we want to hit that mark before we do their first post-test. I think if John were on, he would tell us that he would prefer that we get an initial post-test fairly close to that 40-hour mark. But then after that, really assess at the discretion of the instructor. You all have enough professional wisdom and professional judgment to know when a student is making progress in your class and when that progress might show up on that standardized assessment. So there's no need to over-assess our students, but you do want to take a look at where they are. Do they have a reasonable chance of gaining within the fiscal year? And do I have a post-test for the fiscal year? You want them to have at least one pre and one post each fiscal year, especially if they're gaining hours of instruction with you, because you want to capture any credit that you can for the information that you've taught them. But again, that doesn't mean that you're going to have to post-test on that regular basis. Yes, Cynthia.
Now I gotta figure out how to undo my hand again.
I think you just have to
Okay.
hit it again. There you go.
Yeah, okay. I want to go back on the initial assessment.
Uh-huh.
So if I have a gentleman who came in, he has scores from January, just to make the math easy.
Mhm.
When we hit the fiscal year of July, I do not have to retest him because I can push the scores up 6 months. Okay,
Okay.
it is now in October, so the scores have expired. If I post tape him and he shows a gain, do I not get credit for it? Because
Oh,
it's
you
beyond-
absolutely get credit because you have a valid assessment for this fiscal year because you had that assessment listed as his fiscal year assessment in July. So you're okay. So it's just, did you enter the fiscal year with a valid assessment? Yes, you did, because that
You said
January
that the
test is
assessments are
still
only valid
valid.
for 180 days.
That's it. Because you have it recorded as your fiscal year pre-assessment in July, you're okay. Like that's your pre-assessment for this fiscal year. So the post-assessment is just going to look back at, did you have a valid pre-assessment? Yeah, you did. So even if that, even if you get past that 180 days, it's still going to count. It's still going to be okay.
So the key is that it has to be in LACES as the new pre or the post. If it's not in LACES, that's where it's falling through the cracks.
Exactly.
Got it.
Exactly. And LACES won't let you push an out of range assessment forward after the fact. So you want to be mindful of that at the beginning of the fiscal year. If I went back now and said, oh, I didn't move that assessment forward for this student, even though they carried over, that was a mistake I made. They had an assessment in January. They were still active in July. I should have moved that assessment forward, but I didn't do it. And I try and do it now. LACES will be like, there's no assessment to move forward. It timed out, even though they were active in July. I need to make sure that I do that during the window of time that that assessment is active. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but we have no control of that when inmates are switching back and forth between institutions. So we do get guys that fall between the cracks.
Yep. Yeah, it's hard. Even when it's not correctional, even when they're not just, you know, moving between units, it happens to us too. It happens to everybody. And that's why, you know, just keeping it kind of at the top of your mind, and if your data entry person is kind of able to keep an eye on it, and I know you guys have such volume that it's going to be hard. But yeah, just keeping that in mind, especially when you move from one fiscal year to the other, is really important. Anybody who's still enrolled when you cross those fiscal years, whatever assessments they have that can move forward, move them forward. Yeah. Again, if you're testing with the same test form, like if you go 11 to 11, you have to have at least 120 hours of instruction in between. I don't know anybody who has ever done that other than by accident. And again, I think that is negated if you've got a gap of more than a year. You know, if somebody's been out for more than a year, a lot of times we'll start them with an 11 again, because it's just, there's no carryover there. It's not like you're pre-post. It's like they're starting new again. You can test prior to the minimum recommended hours if there's a reason for an early assessment. Assessment exceptions are actually listed in the state assessment policy. But again, you can't list every single one that anybody's ever going to give you, right? If a student's leaving the program, they're saying, you know, this isn't working for me, it's not working with my schedule, I'm going to stop for a while. If they move out of your service area. We've had assessment exceptions because we've had a student who says, I've got to go on bed rest for my pregnancy, right? And then, you know, they're going on bed rest for the last 2 months of their pregnancy, and then they're going to have a newborn. So who knows when you might get them back, post-test them. If they have to take a leave of absence for another reason. Carla mentioned treatment. That's a reason for an assessment exception. Although you're not going to get a great post-test on somebody who's going into a treatment program. You might want to wait until they come out. They'll do a lot better. If somebody, again, if one of our students is taking a vacation overseas to visit family in the country, their country of origin, we'll a lot of times grab a post-test, because who knows in the world we live in today, if they change their mind and decide to stay, if they have difficulty getting back, all those things can happen. You know, medical reasons, any of those kinds of things. If they tell you that they're going to be stopping out of your program for a while, you can do an assessment exception on that student. Again, you have to have, this is technically what it says in the state assessment policy, you have to have the permission of your administrator. So however that works in your program, you have to have permission to do that early assessment. And then there has to be a comment made in LACES as to why that student needed to be assessed early. So your data management person has to be able to put a reason in there for any of those exceptions that you make for early post tests. You also want to be careful. I mean, if somebody's literally been with you for 13 hours, I don't know how much sense it makes to try and get a post test on them if they're leaving your program. I mean, you can take a flyer on it, but it might not be worth your time and effort, right? And then one more thing here. In the past, we used to be required to track educational functioning levels or measurable skill gains only for the lowest assessed subject area for each student. So in the past, if a student's lowest score on the TABE was in math, then they would have to make their educational functioning level gain in math in order to show a gain for the year. But a few years ago, that requirement for the NRS changed. And now we can show a measurable skill gain on any subject area for which you have a valid pre-test and post-test in the fiscal year. So that means if a student has taken the complete battery of the TABE, so you have reading, math, and language subtests on them, you can post-test that student in any or all of those areas during the fiscal year. And if they make a gain for any subject, then they have a measurable skill gain. You can still only count one measurable skill gain per student per period of participation, but the ability to show that gain in any subject area gives us far more flexibility. It used to kill me when we had students who were studying with us and like they were just stuck on something in math and they just could not get their scores up to the point where they would make that EFL gain, and that was their lowest assessed subject area. But maybe they were only a few scale score points higher in reading and they made a great gain in reading, and they would have had an EFL gain if we could have counted that post test, and it just didn't count. So this makes far more sense to me. So if your students are receiving instruction in multiple subject areas at the same time, you can look and see what makes the most sense for that post test. And then if they miss it, you can try in another subject area if you think you've got a chance to make a gain somewhere else.
Becky, I think that I was supposed to bring up the student who keeps showing up on our list as needing a post test because she took a post test in a different subject. Is this where that fits in?
This is exactly where that fits in. Thank you for reminding me. I knew I put that plant there for a reason, right? So Jeanette's question in the chat kind of is linked to that. LACES would still need to be updated to reflect the track subject, correct? No, you don't have to change the track subject. It will still count as a measurable skills gain. And if you want to double check me on this, all you have to do is subset that particular student and run a table 4 on them, and you should see the gain, right? Which I check myself every once in a while too. But what happens as a result is exactly what Nikita's talking about. When we in LACES run a list of people who need a post test, and a lot of times what we're looking for is people who are eligible for post testing who don't have a measurable skill gain yet for the fiscal year, right? That's usually the list that I run for our teachers. But then what happens is LACES still assigns them like a tracked subject, even though it will recognize a gain in any subject level. And if they haven't been post tested and made a gain in that tracked subject, it will still say they haven't made a gain, even though they technically have, which makes us all nuts. Because then it's like, then the teachers look at that and they're like, no, I thought they made a gain. And then they email me and say, didn't so-and-so make a gain? Yeah, they did. And I just, I'm not mindful enough of those things to knock the people manually off the list. It's something that I wish that they would really change in their reporting feature in LACES so that it wouldn't include those people. Like if they've made a measurable skill gain anywhere, I shouldn't have to post test them again. And then Karen asked me, what about a student who took the GED say in math and that was their test of record? Unfortunately, at this time, GED subtests aren't a measure of gain. They have to complete the entire GED in order for that to count for a measurable skill gain. So if they just have that subtest, then no, it does not count as a positive gain on a post test, because their pre-test was TABE and technically that post test would be GED. Now, people with far more sway than you and I have been lobbying the feds to change this and to make those individual GED subtests able to show a gain in that subject area. Because yeah, if that student completes their GED math subtest, they've shown that they have the skills, right? But so far, NRS does not allow us to take that individual GED subtest and use it as a measure of a measurable skill gain for the year. I wish that was different, but it's not yet. I'm hopeful that within my lifetime it will be.
So Becky, that's kind of why we tried to test in more than one area with the TABE, because one student just tests in math TABE and then they get their math GED. We don't have a subject,
right?
We'd have to actually pre-test in another subject and it wouldn't count as a post-test, like reading or language.
So yeah, I mean, yeah, technically, and you could give them a TABE post-test in math at that point to try and grab that gain. But yeah, I think it is good practice. And again, I don't want to advocate over testing, but I think it's good practice to get at least an initial complete battery on students so that you do have more options there. And remember this too, there's no saying that you can't start the year with like just a math subtest in TABE as your test of record and then do a reading later in the year, right? You can put that reading score in, and if you get another reading score in that same fiscal year, it's still going to count that as pre-post, even if it wasn't the official test of record, and you can still get a gain on that. So yeah, if somebody comes in and they have their math score as their score of record, or their math score is the only TABE score that you have, and then they finish their math subtest on the GED, you can give them a reading TABE and use that for your instructional goal setting and your instructional measure, and then get them that reading post test later on in the fiscal year. Just to muddy the waters even further. This stuff isn't easy, you guys. There's a reason that this is one whole session all by itself, because there are so many ins and outs with policy and with the way the pre and post testing works, and the little nuances of getting the data entry done in a certain way. It's a lot. It's a lot.
Becky, I got a couple of questions for you here. First
Yep.
of all, this form that you have up on the screen now, can you send that to us?
Oh yeah, I can
Yeah,
send you a
good.
copy of all
Okay.
these slides if you'd like.
Okay,
Yeah.
I would like to have that slide for
Yep.
my instructors too. And then the other thing is, I'm just curious, when you guys are doing your pre-testing, when they come in, do you generally do the language one too, or do you just usually stick with the math and reading?
At Cornerstones, we do the language one too. And a couple of reasons. Number one, our teachers just like to have that information, especially for the RLA, for the writing part, to know if there's any big red flags in grammar or usage or anything like that that they might want to address. The other reason is because especially with our English language learners who move up into GED levels, that language test is often the one that gives us the areas that we need to work on the most with them. The reading and writing for our English language learners who move up into GED is usually the area where they need most help from us. So we do the language as part of our initial pre-testing usually. Yeah.
Well, if
Yeah.
a student comes in, though, Becky, and they're gonna take a math class, and we only have time to get one TABE done before they can start class, we usually try to do the TABE in the class that they're gonna be taking and then get the other ones later.
That's a good point
Our
too.
initial one is whatever
Yes.
class they're gonna be taking.
Yes,
too.
that's a good point too. Because yeah, we don't make them take the complete battery all at once. We split it up. So yeah. Does that help, Carla?
Yes, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions? Comments, concerns? All right. Hearing none, I'm going to cut you loose early on this Friday. Thank you all for your attention and your questions. I love the questions. It's like I said, it's a lot. It's a lot to take in. It's a lot to remember, and it's always good to review and refresh our memories on it. We've got one more of these left. The next one, I'm going to count on you all for a lot of information on what you're doing in your own programs too. Our next webinar, we're going to be talking about best practices for talking about the TABE with your participants. So talking about it before testing, And then also talking about results and how you're using the TABE results to motivate your students and inform your instruction. So that'll be the last one in our TABE series. That happens the next Friday. Excuse me. Same time, same Zoom link. I hope to see you all here. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Stay warm out there. And hopefully the sun's shining everywhere when I talk to you next Friday.
Becky, I just want to take the time just to thank you for this. You know, like I said, I've been doing this for a long time. I'm glad I chose to do this training, even though I've been doing it, because I've learned a lot already. So thank you.
Thank you, Carla. I appreciate that. Like I said, I always learn a lot when I have to get ready for them because it helps me remember all the things that are important that we don't always think about every single day when we're doing our jobs. So I appreciate that a lot. Thank you, Carla.
Yeah, and I just ditto that, Becky. It's always good to get a refresher because there's things that change and things that we don't know, even if we've done it a long time.
Exactly. Exactly.
Thanks,
All right,
Becky.
everybody. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Becky, before you skip out, can I just ask you something?